So on behalf of the Sadat Chair and the Gildenhorn Institute, I'm very happy to host Dr. Guy Ziv. Guy is one of ours. He did his PhD here for 6 years at the Department of Government and Politics. Was my student, my excellent student, I should add, and my research assistant. And did a fabulous dissertation on why Hawkish leaders sometimes become dovish and whether or not that has an impact on the foreign policies of states. Does it really matter anyway for how states actually behave? And is there something that we can learn that's generalizable, expecting some leaders to move more toward peacemaking, which is the subject of this talk? The occasion, of course, is the publication of his new book that was based on the dissertation. And I may add, it's worth reading, and if you can afford it, you should buy it. It's really a superb book, and I'm very happy to see it finally in print. But the talk beyond the book will go also more into the current situation of sort of thinking about whether it's possible for Hawkish leaders to make peace. I mean, obviously, very often we don't really know whether they're capable of it until they do it. And it's great leaders are not recognized beforehand, but only after they act in a great way. And sometimes we don't know the circumstances that would lead them to change course. So it's really a great pleasure to have you here. Guy is now a professor at American University at the School of International Relations and has been there for how many years now? 5.5 years. They just had a book release event for him that was very successful at AU, and I'm sure this will be great. After he presents his talk, he'll obviously be willing to take some questions. Well, thanks. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Hi, everybody. Does everybody hear me? Yes. I want to thank Professor Talhami for the very nice introduction and for plugging my book. Appreciate that. I'm a little concerned with Harper Lee's new novel that it's going to cut into sales of my book. But, I want to also thank the Sadat Chair and the Gildenhorn Institute for co-sponsoring this event. Professor Yoram Perry, thank you very much. And I also want to thank Samantha Levine and Brittany Kaiser for really doing a lot of the legwork and logistical work, and of course ordering the nice lunch you guys are enjoying here. It's been nearly a year since the Kerry-sponsored, Kerry-brokered peace talks collapsed, and a lot of people are asking what are the prospects that Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking are going to be renewed following the March 17th Israeli elections. If Netanyahu is reelected, is he going to ask Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, to resume peace talks with him in a serious manner? And if he does, will Abbas agree to do so? And what is the likelihood that President Obama is going to agree to or want to engage in this kind of process when so far it has not yielded any fruit and he has a lot more pressing foreign policy priorities these days? When I look at the political situation in Israel today and following closely the campaigns, and I see 5 different puzzles that I think help to explain what we're seeing in public opinion polls in Israel. The first puzzle is that we're seeing a phenomenon of hawkish politicians turning to dovish policies. This has happened in a number of places around the world, but it's really been a very Israeli, a very unique Israeli phenomenon in the past 10, 15, 20 years even, with Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ariel Sharon, Ehud Olmert, and Tzipi Livni, just among the many leaders who started out with very hawkish views and turned towards a much more dovish foreign policy orientation. Second puzzle is the simultaneous hawkish and dovish shifts in Israeli society. So on the one hand, the Israeli electorate has moved in a decidedly right-wing direction in recent years. And we see Likud is continuing to be the largest party in the Knesset. Most Israelis also, according to opinion polls, identify with the right, much more so than the left or even the center left. A new poll shows that 55% of Jewish Israelis prefer the right, 33% the center left. Another recent poll finds 67% of first-time voters define themselves as either right-wing or center-right. And I attribute this to a number of reasons. The demographic shifts we've seen in Israel with immigration from the former Soviet Union, the Second Intifada, which really shattered the Israeli left, the aftermath of the 2005 disengagement from the Gaza Strip, which left Hamas in power and shelling Israeli villages and cities in southern Israel. The lack of a charismatic left-of-center figure in Israeli politics, and finally, hostile and inflammatory rhetoric by President Abbas, not to mention attitudes towards Israel on the Palestinian street. In the upcoming elections, regardless of whether the Zionist Union, that's the Herzog-Livni, the Labor Party, and Livni's party, they had a merger, they're calling themselves the Zionist Union, regardless of whether they or Netanyahu's Likud party prevail, I think that the right-wing bloc is going to easily get more seats in parliament than the center-left. At the same time, however, the positions on core issues have moved to the left, and this is why I call it a puzzle or a paradox. You have, up until the mid-90s, the only ones who really suggested in Israel a two-state solution, a Palestinian state, the only ones who really talked about it were those on the left, even far left. And today it's commonly accepted even by many supporters of the right who are on record as supporting a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. Up until the 2000s, only the left spoke of a division of Jerusalem. Today you have a healthy debate about whether or not Jerusalem should be divided in a final peace agreement. Third puzzle is that socioeconomic issues predominate, yet Likud remains in power. Even by Likud members' admissions, Likud hasn't done very much to address a lot of the socioeconomic concerns of the public. That's been a key issue in recent years, overtaking more traditional security diplomatic issues. And the Israeli electorate is still sticking with Likud despite its lack of action on some of these issues, like lowering the price of household goods, lowering the cost of housing in Tel Aviv and other major cities. And I think the reason they haven't taken such a toll is A, tribalism. A lot of people who vote for Likud will stick with Likud no matter what. And B, the social justice constituency has really divided itself among the different parties. So they're not really loyal to any one specific party. They're going to Yesh Atid, and they're going to Labor, and they're going to a whole host of parties, including the new Kulanu party, the center-right party led by Kahlon. A fourth puzzle is that the right is identified with security, but the security establishment tends to identify with the center-left. This is a really interesting phenomenon in Israel. The vast majority of former IDF chiefs of staff, former heads of military intelligence, former heads of Mossad, former heads of Shin Bet, are very uncomfortable with the views and positions voiced by the right wing in Israel. So there's a disconnect. They're much closer in terms of their ideas to the center-left than they are to the right. Yet this hasn't really resonated among the public. I don't think most Israelis are really attuned to these differences, and perhaps part of the problem is that the center-left hasn't done enough to highlight this discrepancy. But just in the past few weeks, we've heard statement after statement made by some of these officials, these ex-security officials, who voiced concern about Netanyahu's approach. And some of them have gone on to actually join these center-left parties. Others have remained outside the political process, but are still giving interviews and writing op-eds critical of the government's policy. And finally, the final puzzle is that Israel is becoming increasingly isolated, but Israelis don't seem to take notice. And of course, The most recent example is the bad blood between the Obama and Netanyahu administration, which has gone on now for years, much longer than previous U.S.-Israeli crises. But if you take a look at some of the actions made by European countries in support of Palestinian statehood, despite Israeli opposition in Sweden, in France, in Britain, and elsewhere, not to mention the BDS movement, which is growing, you really see an Israel that is becoming somewhat more isolated, increasingly more isolated. Yet the Israeli public also, again, does not really seem to take notice. This is not making a huge difference in the polls. But I return now to my first puzzle, which is why so many of these hawkish leaders have turned to dovish policies. This is a very important question, both theoretically, because in international relations there's no systematic treatment of foreign policy change. But it's also important empirically, because if we can identify who's more likely or less likely to change foreign policy courses, we can also work towards identifying these figures, working with them, and knowing who we can work with and who we really can't work with. So the question I ask in my research is, why do some hawkish leaders turn to dovish policies mid-career? Why does that occur? And when I use the terms hawk and dove, in this context, in the Israeli context, I'm specifically referring to their positions on towards the Palestinians, specifically on the matter of territorial compromise, settlements in the occupied territories. The third criteria I use is negotiations with the PLO, which has long been viewed as a terrorist organization. And finally, a leader's positions on Palestinian state, whether he or she supports a two-state solution. I don't want to get into the academic jargon here, but the kind of mainstream international relations literature takes a more rationalist approach and assumes that leaders will change their ideas based on circumstances on the ground, that people will update their beliefs given new information. Yet political psychologists disagree with that notion. Cognitive psychologists find that people are actually consistency seekers. They will take those bits and pieces of information that confirm their beliefs, and they'll discard those pieces of information that contradicts their beliefs. Yet we do know that some people are still more prone to changing their beliefs than others. Why is that the case? And here I use insight from cognitive psychologists to point out that some leaders are more cognitively open and complex than others. By openness, I mean those who are more amenable to new information from the environment, including information that will challenge their beliefs. And by complexity, I refer to whether or not a leader sees people, events, situations in black and white terms or in shades of gray. So it's the number of dimensions that a leader thinks of when he or she sees the world. Shimon Peres is my primary case study because I see him as a paradigmatic case of a hawk who turned towards to dovish policies. And we have a 70-year career here. So from a research standpoint, he's a good case study because there's so much literature on him, so many archival sources that I was able to dig up that have been declassified. And it's interesting to see how he's evolved over the years, from the 1950s when he was a staunch hawk to this very day when he's seen as kind of a champion of Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. So what I do is I look at kind of three phases. I divide up his career into three phases. The first phase is from 1953 to 1977 that I define as his hawkish period. This is a period where Peres is supporting aggressive counterterrorism raids. He is very dismissive of any kind of talk of compromise with the Arab world. Now keep in mind this is pre-1967, before Israel became an occupier of the West Bank and Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem and the Golan Heights. So just a quote from Peres from something he said in 1955. Only if we demonstrate that we're a nation that has physical strength, military preparedness, military manpower to win or bend the Arabs in a war, and if we will have statesmen and leaders willing to use this strength, not for conquering, not for war, but to protect what we've attained, maybe that's the only way in which we can ensure peace that does not entail indefinite concessions. So he's leaving the door open for peace, but he's taking a very hard line stance, especially when you compare him with other figures in his party. And so Ben-Gurion, his mentor and the prime minister and defense minister, charges Peres with acquiring arms for the Jewish state. France becomes Israel's first major ally, thanks to Peres' efforts, and Peres is able to really beef up Israel's military and army that will then be big enough, strong enough to win the 56 and 1967 wars. As a result, primarily of arms purchases, Peres was involved in with the French, secret arms purchases throughout the 1950s. And by the way, the nuclear talks that he had with the French, also very secret. To this very day, Israel does not acknowledge its nuclear status, but that was also a result of Peres' activities in France in the 1950s. From 1967 until 1977, so this is post-67, Peres is a hawk. He opposes the very idea of territorial compromise. That's a major Labor Party plank in its platform to negotiate the newly conquered territories in return for peace. Peres opposes that. He's seeking a regional arrangement with Jordan that does not entail, at that point in time, territorial compromise. He opposes the PLO, any kind of talks with the PLO. He says the most moderate people in the PLO call for peace without Israel. Of course, he opposes the idea of a Palestinian state, and he supports settlements. He's one of the first founder of settlements in the West Bank when he serves as Rabin's defense minister in Yitzhak Rabin's first labor-led government. From 1977 until 1987, that's the first, I consider that the first part of his dovish turn. There are a couple triggering events here. Peres becomes the leader of the Labor Party and the head of the opposition to Menachem Begin's first Likud-led government. And as leader of the opposition, he has to take into consideration other viewpoints of his Labor Party colleagues, and slowly becomes a supporter of the idea, the notion of territorial compromise or Latin for peace. And of course, that very year, 1977, a very important year in the Middle East, that's the year that Sadat makes his surprise trip to Jerusalem and addresses the Israeli people in the Knesset. That too had a very significant impact on Peres' thinking. So he emerges as a supporter of the peace process, still opposes talks with the PLO, still opposes the idea of a Palestinian state, but we definitely see a much more dovish turn in the late 70s and throughout much of the 80s. From 1987 to 97, we see the second part, the culmination of his dovish turn. His Jordanian option, the idea of having solving the Palestinian problem through Jordan, is dead when King Hussein basically washes his hands free of the West Bank. King Hussein announces on July 31st, 1988, that he's severing all administrative and legal duties in the West Bank except for the Muslim holy sites in Jerusalem. For Peres, this is an indication that no longer is the Jordanian option an option, and Israel would now have little choice but to pursue talks with the PLO. So a position that he gradually adopts. Peres says, he writes, "My preference is the agreement I reached with King Hussein in London. The minute that Shamir torpedoed it, the choice was either not to negotiate with anybody or to negotiate with the Palestinians. Now, the Palestinians had to make a choice between the PLO and Hamas, and I thought that the PLO was better, simple as that." And he also ends up supporting, in the 90s, the idea of a Palestinian state, idea he had long rejected, and that's due to the Oslo peace agreements that he and Rabin helped negotiate with the PLO, and the logical extension of the Oslo talks would, of course, have been a Palestinian state. So I look at Peres' cognitive structure. I mentioned earlier the two concepts that go hand in hand, his openness and complexity, and find that of the leaders I look at, I compare him with three other Israeli prime ministers. Peres is by far the most open and the most complex. I interviewed dozens of people who knew Peres well, know Peres well, and all of them were emphasizing the idea that Peres is a good listener, that he hires staff aides who are highly, young, ambitious, highly talented, and not afraid to challenge his ideas. And he also sees things in multiple shades. He's a very nuanced type of thinker, so he's a very open and complex personality. And I argue that that's really what helped Peres reformulate his views on a lot of these issues. With Rabin, his arch rival within labor, you see kind of also a relatively open and complex person, but not quite as open, not quite as complex as Peres. I feel, by the way, a little awkward talking about this when we have a former Rabin aide sitting right in front of me here. So you might agree or disagree with what I have to say. I'd be interested in hearing from you on that. But Rabin tended to be a little more closed, not as open to other people. He was more of an introvert. But he did adjust his ideas once he came across new information. And so there were a number of issues, a number of matters where Rabin changed his opinion. On the Entebbe operation, at first he opposed having a military raid, and he then was convinced that a military raid was necessary to free Israeli hostages. There were a few other instances. The Levi fighter jet is another example where he at first supported having this, spending the kind of money that would allow Israel to build this homemade plane. He then changed his mind on that, and then he switched his mind again afterwards. So there were a number of instances that I look at where he was able to change his opinion based on new information from the environment. But in contrast, I also look at what I call the dogs who didn't bark, dogs that don't bark, and that's Shamir and Begin, two Israeli prime ministers, Yitzhak Shamir and Menachem Begin, who were very rigid in their views, very ideologically rigid. For Begin, the Holocaust was was the lesson of history, and he would lecture world leaders about the Holocaust. It was an analogy he used time and again. And though he did give up the Sinai Peninsula in return for peace with Egypt, he never had any intention to budge on the Palestinian issue. Shamir was actually the most ideologically rigid of the leaders I look at. He held an extremely narrow and undifferentiated worldview, and not known for being a good listener, would constantly referred to critics as enemies of the state of Israel and to Jewish critics as quote-unquote self-hating Jews. So definitely somebody who was much more closed and rigid in his view. Now, let's apply some of these findings to the current crop of leaders that some of you might be more familiar or interested in because of the ongoing elections and situation in Israel today. So Ariel Sharon, the former prime minister, was actually also more open and complex than he's often given credit for. I spoke to one of his former aides, who told me, a couple of his former aides, one of whom told me that when he was hired, he told Sharon that he did not vote for him, that he voted for the other party. And Sharon's response was, I'm hiring you because I want you to do a good job and I want to hear your opinion. I know my opinion. I don't need to hear my opinion. I want to hear your opinion. And that kind of shows more openness than he's maybe often given credit for. And of course, we know that Sharon, kind of the founder of Likud, the founder of the Likud party, over his career, once he becomes prime minister, begins to talk about the idea of a Palestinian state. He endorses that idea in December of 2002. The following year, he accepts President Bush's roadmap for peace. So essentially, this is the first time the Israeli government formally endorses the idea of a two-state solution. And he even begins to use the word occupation, which to this very day is anathema to many members of Likud. And of course, in the summer of 2005, he finally withdraws from the Gaza Strip in a unilateral move. Following his move from Likud, he breaks away from Likud, forms his own party of moderates that is dedicated to a two-state solution. That party is the Kadima party. His successor, Ehud Olmert, also another example of a lifetime hawk who became a dove. Ehud Olmert was this young, brash Likud MK who was one of the few MKs, one of the few members of Knesset to vote against Camp David. Okay, I mean that's how right-wing he was, and over time he became much more dovish. In 2005, I'm just going to read from a quote. In 2005, he gave the following speech, which would have been unthinkable 10 or 20 years earlier. The existence of two nations, one Jewish and one Palestinian, is the full solution to the national aspirations and problems of each of the peoples. The choice between allowing Jews to live in all parts of the land of Israel and living in a state with a Jewish majority mandates giving up parts of the land of Israel. He will not be able to continue ruling over the territories in which the majority of the Palestinian population lives. And if you didn't know it was Olmert, you would think that's kind of one of the left-wing leaders of maybe even Labor or parties to the left of Labor. But that was Ehud Olmert, the former prime minister. A couple words I want to conclude on the current situation with the elections that we're facing today. So I'm going to quote from Peres, who was asked what his views were on the current crop of candidates and the choice that Israelis are being faced with. And his response was, there are two camps, one for a two-state solution and one for managing the crisis. And I think that really aptly depicts where Netanyahu is. Netanyahu is in the camp of not quite there on a Palestinian state or on a two-state solution, but supporting some sort of measures, economic measures primarily, but maybe even political measures to ease the crisis and manage the status quo. So it's all about managing the crisis, not resolving it. The main opponent, the main opposition to Netanyahu is Herzog, Isaac Herzog, who has teamed up with Tzipi Livni. Also, Tzipi Livni, a former Likud member of Knesset, who was a hawk, who has become much more of a dove. She joined Ehud Olmert and Ariel Sharon in the formation of Kadima 10 years ago, and she has remained much more dovish in her outlook. And finally, Netanyahu. So I see Netanyahu as more closed and more simple than some of his opponents are. There are two factors that tend to be critical to Netanyahu when making hiring decisions and when surrounding himself with aides. One is personal loyalty, very important to him, and the other one is Likud party affiliation. So you see very few people advising him who are from who have other perspectives. And just last week, a former Mossad chief, Meir Dagan, who had worked for both Sharon and Netanyahu, said that whereas with Sharon, he felt he was able to express disagreements whenever disagreements arose. With Netanyahu, that was not the case. Netanyahu had to frequently remind him that he was a subordinate, and he had to carry out Netanyahu's orders, and Netanyahu was not really interested in his perspective. So Netanyahu is really surrounded by more or less yes men, people who are going to give him the kind of views that confirm his worldview. He is a lifelong opponent of the Palestinian state. In his 1993 book, he writes, such a state would nullify the whole value of the buffer area on Israel's eastern front, and he wrote that Jordan was a two-state solution to resolve the conflict between two peoples. And as early as February 2009, after he got elected, he continued to oppose a two-state solution. Only several months later did he announce in Bar Ilan that he supported a Palestinian state, but I think this needs to be seen as more of a tactical response, a perspective that's offered by many Israeli observers, including some of Netanyahu's own colleagues, who said that he never really fully embraced the idea of a Palestinian state. And certainly with the exception of the 10-month freeze on settlements, he's done very little to pursue the two-state solution. What's interesting is that his own Likud party continues to oppose a Palestinian state, and to this very day, you will not be able to find the Likud platform, because the Likud platform has not been made public. So we can't know for certain whether the Likud party endorses or opposes the Palestinian state. What we do know is that most of the government ministers and most Likud MKs oppose the idea of a Palestinian state. And finally, some predictions here about what to expect in a month from now. Got a little under 40 days until the elections. I think that barring either a major unexpected event or a significant development in some of the corruption allegations we've seen in the last couple of weeks, I would expect Netanyahu to form the next government. It's quite possible that he will tie with Livni and Herzog, but even then, Livni and Herzog would have a much more difficult time forming a coalition than Netanyahu. And I do not expect him to make a push for a two-state solution, assuming he does get elected. I mentioned earlier, I don't really expect the White House to get involved anytime soon and revisit this issue, an issue that's really dogged them, and nothing ever good has come out of it so far. And given all the other foreign policy crises, given that Obama will have that lame duck status and that he's going to be concerned about Hillary Clinton, the presumptive Democratic nominee, I think that they're probably going to lay low for a while. But I want to conclude on a hopeful note for those who are hoping to see some move in terms of the peace process. One is that I think that one possible outcome of these elections is to see a new revitalized opposition and in Israel. One thing we haven't seen in years is any kind of real unified opposition to Netanyahu's policies. You had politicians bickering, and you have some ad hoc statements made here and there, but there's really been no unified opposition. Now could be a turning point in that regard, and that could bode well for Labor and other parties in the next elections. Also, we might see more Arab League involvement. There have been so many regional events that affect more of the Arab world than Israel, but one possible solution that's been talked about, and it's not really a clear-cut solution, it's more of a framework, will be to involve the Arab League and the Arab states. You still have the Arab Peace Initiative on the table, but perhaps a more robust involvement by the Saudis and other parties in the region is certainly in the realm of possibility. And finally, I will end on the hawk and dove note, which is to say that we don't really know for sure who next in Israel is going to be a hawk who turns to dovish policies. I'm not really holding my breath when it comes to Netanyahu, but it's certainly not inconceivable that even Netanyahu will turn to a more dovish outlook when he's concerned about his legacy, assuming he wins the next elections. Thank you. Please.
So, I'm Peter Wien, I teach Middle East history in the history department. How, in your research in the book, how do you distinguish between convictions and mere rhetoric? Because I think you could make that argument, Dov, Hawk, in a much more, you could look at it in a much more cynical way, I think, where much of the dovish positions that politicians take does not necessarily entail a vision of what happens when the two-state solution would actually take place. There are so many steps in between, and there are so many contingencies around people that taking a dovish position is not necessarily, I think, a position that entails the readiness to take that very last step. And how do you distinguish between those two?
So first of all, in international relations, I'm looking at the learning literature, and one contribution I try to make in my research is that one can distinguish a leader who is just adopting a certain position for mere tactical reasons versus somebody who's maybe whose strategy and perhaps even worldview has changed by looking at a couple things, including the amount of time that has evolved from the time that they first announced their new position. And so when we look at learning over time, we kind of develop a much clearer picture of which leaders have actually evolved and which leaders may have taken or said something momentarily and maybe switched later on. So the temporal dimension is very, very important here in determining who's really adopted this for tactical reasons versus who's really adopted it because they believe in it now. And I also look at the rhetoric. Has it really changed? Has it changed consistently? And I in terms of speeches, in terms of what they've written, and I interview people and ask them, people who know these political elites and journalists and others who cover this, their points of view. And so that's how you get a pretty clear picture that emerges on Peres, and with Netanyahu, it's still too early. It's really still too early to kind of make any kind of definitive argument. Even with Sharon, I would argue it's a little too early. I don't know if we'll ever actually figure it out because he had a stroke that incapacitated him. So he held his cards close to his chest. So we don't know the precise nature of his vision in terms of whether he actually would have gone full on and supported a two-state solution, or whether the withdrawal from Gaza and from four smaller settlements in the West Bank was more of a tactical move, but I believe that he probably would have gone further than Netanyahu, that he didn't evolve. Sharon was asked, how could you, the father of settlements, the person who said that settlements in Gaza were just as important as Tel Aviv, how could you withdraw from the Gaza Strip? And his response was, I see things differently from here, as Prime Minister. See things differently from here than I saw from over there. And so I think that was very tough. Yeah?
First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. You mentioned the relatively recent swing of the Israeli public to the right. So I was thinking of that in correlation with the new President Ruvi Rivlin. How do you see that is this kind of the new hawk to dove, where you have someone who very adamantly opposed the Gaza disengagement with Sharon, and yet has taken on this new issue of civil rights, human rights with Israeli Arab citizens, and trying to find some sort of compromise, but also even a month ago he came out and said he's still a proponent of greater Israel. So is this like the new dove, where you kind of like are a one-stater, but at the same time you are more for Arab rights?
So I don't think so. No, I mean my criteria for dove and hawk are the same, really. And I don't think that Ruvi Rivlin, the new president of Israel, has become a dove. I think he's just as hawkish today as he was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago. He hasn't budged on a territorial compromise on the Palestinian issue. But he is, as president, and even before he was president, he was always highly respected by the Arab minority in Israel, who, by the way, helped put him in, voted for him, essentially. And that's because he's always had a great relationship with them and supports civil rights. So there's not necessarily this contradiction between supporting, civil rights and human rights and opposing Palestinian statehood, because he does have that vision that I personally disagree with, but he does hold that vision of a greater Israel. And I don't think he's budged from that. Yeah.
Thank you, Guy, for a very interesting talk. I didn't finish reading your book, I just started. I enjoyed very much the concept of the psychological element of change. But in Israel, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think only in Israel you have another phenomenon which has to do with the system, which is not a psychology of various private people, but the system, and that is that 6 prime ministers from different parties, from 3 parties, have changed their position from Hawkish to dovish. And you mentioned probably all of them. You didn't mention Barak. Now, usually the answer that everybody is using is Sharon answer, what I see from here, I didn't see from there.
Right.
But if 5 before him and 2 after him, all of them do this move towards the same direction, what you have to find some systemic issue there, or systemic cause there. Something that has to do with institutional structure. Are they all liars, or do they all know in advance what their position will be when they will be prime ministers, and they try to buy the public opinion, or is it very strong pressure from the outside once they are prime ministers? What's happening there when these people take the chair of the prime minister?
Okay, so I don't think it's institutional. I think that when they're prime ministers, I think they see that, and it's not just when they're prime ministers. They don't have to wait until they become prime minister until they make this change. In Olmert's case, he became more dovish before he became prime minister. So I think what it is a combination of 2 major factors. One is demographic realities. Israeli prime ministers, Israeli leaders want to ensure that Israel remain a Jewish and democratic state. And Israel cannot remain both Jewish and democratic if the status quo continues indefinitely. And I think they're aware of this and they're concerned about it. And this is what Sharon and Olmert and others who have changed their positions over the years have talked about. And the second reason, of course, that they won't talk about as much, but that is fairly obvious to me, is international pressure. The world expects Israel to move on a 2-state solution. President Bush, President Clinton actually began with his parameters. Bush continued that with his roadmap. Didn't push hard for it, but he retained that idea, and Sharon adopted the roadmap because of his support for it. and of course President Obama, and I would assume the next American president will as well. So, and that's just the U.S. So the world is demanding that Israel act that. But I do think it's personal. I think that the personality here matters, because how else would you explain why it took Netanyahu up until June of 2009 to even utter the words Palestinian state, and only weeks later to talk about a two-state solution, whereas all the other ones had done it years before. And so I do attribute it here to personality, because some people are more likely to evolve and change their views than others, and to go further than others. And this is what I find with Peres. Peres really went further than some of the others when he changed his when he changed his positions on the Palestinian issue. Dick?
Hey, my name is Jake Spray. I'm a freshman here, undergraduate student. You're a great guy for being here. Thank you very much. I have a question and a comment. My first comment, going off of what Professor Perry said about the system here, is that it's interesting in America is that there is an opposite phenomenon going on in which liberal American politicians consistently move towards a more hawkish stance or a more right-wing stance on Israel's issues. If you look at an example such as Hillary Clinton, who was a very staunch supporter of liberal Zionism, but had to transition to a more conservative stance over the years in response to the fact that liberal candidates in America already are guaranteed the more liberal vote and have to bring in the conservative demographic. So it's just interesting that our system kind of produces an opposite result. It seems like the Israeli system might be producing more hawkish leaders more dovish leaders, while America's system is leading to more hawkish leaders in Israel. So that's just a comment. My question is for you is that in your research, did you consider age and experience as something that leads to these more dovish tendencies, and that with Shimon and Peres is that, towards the end of their careers and as they've grown older, that they're becoming more dovish. So is that, a product of the Israeli system? Is that a product of the times, or is it a product of them having the experiences and being able to become wiser and more aware of what's actually happening in their country?
I think age might be an element, but no, I didn't, because I have a chapter in my book which is devoted to identifying the different leaders' cognitive structure, irrespective of their views on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, because I wanted to avoid a tautology and to kind of make the circular argument. And so I found that even when these figures were younger, I looked at other ideas and other issues they had, and some were simply more likely to change their mind on certain things and use kind of language that was different. When you look at discourse analysis, it's very interesting to see the language they use. Peres uses constantly the kind of more nuanced language. Rabin was, when he talked about security, Rabin, the former IDF general and war hero who became a statesman, he uses a much more complex idea of what security means, a much more expansive definition of what security means. It's not just security in the narrow military sense, as opposed to, say, Shamir, who, when interviewed, will invariably use words like undoubtedly or without a doubt. I'm 100% sure I was right on this or I right on that. And I look at that in other issues. So I don't think age is necessarily the key variable here. I think it's more the personality and how some people are just more likely to change their views in general on different core issues than others.
Are there notable examples of doves that became more hawkish?
Yes, there are fewer and far between. But in the context of Israeli politics, you have, for example, Minister Yuval Steinitz, who is in Likud, government minister, who years ago was an activist in Peace Now. Okay, so that's an example of a dove who became a hawk. Another newcomer, I don't even remember her name, who is also an activist in Peace Now, who is now on board with Bennett's far-right party, Jewish Home. So there are definitely a few of those examples. Some have argued that Jimmy Carter came to office as a staunch supporter of détente with the Soviets, changing the way that Ford and Nixon, his predecessors, had dealt with the Soviets, adopting a much more dovish approach. He was much closer to his Secretary of State's views, Cy Vance, than he was to Zbigniew Brzezinski's views. Brzezinski was his hardline NSC advisor, but that following the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and several other kind of events that took place during his White House years, Carter's positions became a lot more hawkish towards the Soviets. And so that could be seen as an example, some have argued that that could be seen as an example of a dove who became more hawkish. But mostly we see the Nixon going to China. You know, Nixon, the lifelong anti-communist who opens the door to China. Or Anwar Sadat, the leader of Egypt who attacks Israel during the Yom Kippur War in 1973. 4 years later, visits Jerusalem and talks peace. So that's more of the pattern that we see. Yeah, Paul.
Paul Sham, I teach Israeli history and the conflict here in the Golden Horn Institute. I'm struck by the fact that you didn't really discuss the ideological background of these people, which I think makes a difference in the context of the 50s, 60s, and even the 70s. Peres was a hawk compared to some of the, or many of the Labor Party figures, but certainly he never had an ideology similar to Begin, let alone the current Jewish home religious right-wing ideology. And I think it's also useful to look at a cohort. The well-known examples of the so-called Likud princes, most of whom became more or less dovish in the last 20 or even 30 years. But they're fundamentally different ideologically from the mainstream of Likud today, let alone the Jewish Home Party. So I wonder if I'm not denying the relevance of the factors you brought up, but I think the ideological background of the different periods also has an awful lot to do with it.
Sure, so you're absolutely right, and I didn't talk about ideology in my presentation, but I deal with ideology extensively in the book. And what I find is that it's definitely important to contextualize these leaders within the backgrounds that they came from. So definitely ideology is important and shouldn't be ignored, but it's not a key variable, it's not a key factor, because if it were, how would you explain Olmert and Sharon's change? So Sharon was never grew up in maybe a more Mapai household, but Olmert was the son of Jabotinsky followers and devotees, and he himself was a lifelong devotee of Zev Jabotinsky, the leader of the right-wing, revisionist movement. So we're seeing these hawk to dove shifts, even among those with very different ideological background. Even after Oslo, I looked at who supported Oslo, who didn't support the Oslo talks in the Israeli parliament, and there were a few Likud right-wingers or Likud MKs who were more open and accepting of Oslo, even though it was a minority. And there were also a few laborites who opposed the Oslo agreements. And so ideology just simply is not enough to explain why somebody might change their position. Yeah.
I think, when you make a psychological dichotomy, it's always difficult, because psychology is a lot of name-calling or calling terms to things. I think I get the impression that when you talk about open and rigid to explain the changes, it sounds heavily laden with value judgment. somehow a person who's open and someone else could call it something very, very different. They say, instead of calling them rigid, they'd say that they're very true to their nature, their beliefs, they have a strong ego, be psychoanalytic. So I find that kind of troubling. I mean, I think there are a lot of explanations for many things. And I think that someone could say that someone who's open is really someone who's could be very responsive to, chameleon, very chameleon, like sees the way things are going and changes. I also think that age and experience could have a tremendous amount. But I'm most concerned about the sense that somehow it's better if you're open. And it depends on what you mean by open, and if that's a psychological term, I'm not familiar with it.
Okay, well, certainly, I never used the word better or worse in describing it.
But it sounds, I know you don't, but it sounds inherent.
Okay, I mean, I basically, I didn't make up these terms. These are terms that are established in the literature. If you look at the literature of cognitive psychology, it's a continuum. It's not like you're in one box or another box. There's a continuum between openness and closed, between simple and complexity. So I look at, and this is obviously a rich interpretation, so it's going to be somewhat subjective, but I try to minimize that subjectivity by looking at what others have said about these leaders, both in print and writing, and also orally, in interviews that I've conducted, and interviews that have been published. And so you get a composite, you get a picture of these people. But to some extent, yes, it is interpretive. Yeah, Carla.
Yes. Firstly, thank you for your presentation. My question is, how much of this maneuvering do you think is due to practical considerations related to political violence?
So can you repeat?
How much of this, sort of shift in leaders is in response to political violence, so much as a practical sense that, well, we have to know that this is happening?
Political violence, you mean as in wars?
Between the occupied territories and Israel.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't measure. I don't do a quantitative analysis where I can measure these things. But I think that in Rabin's case, you see a big shift in terms of his positions when he becomes prime minister and supporting the Oslo agreements, in large part because of the Intifada, the first Intifada, when he was defense minister and tried and ordered soldiers to break their bones, right? And those are actually the words that he used. And then realized that you couldn't do that, that you could not you can't end a insurrection with a traditional army. And that's when he kind of put two and two together and realized that you have to have a political solution here. And sure enough, when he ran for prime minister shortly thereafter, he argued that this conflict can only be resolved politically, not militarily, and that he would end the Intifada, and that he would have some sort of an autonomy plan or progress towards a Palestinian solution within the first 6 to 9 months of being elected. So I know that definitely shaped his perspective. That was the main thing. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Howard Sumka. I was the director of USAID for West Bank and Gaza for 4 years, and then the CEO of the One Voice movement for a year. It seems to me that much of the way you define Hawk, or at least the way you define Dove, depends a lot on what leaders said rather than on what they did. And so, for example, in the case of Ariel Sharon, you talk about the roadmap, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find much of the roadmap that really got implemented. And in fact, when he accepted it, there were 14 reservations that he laid out that basically nullified the whole agreement, came close to nullifying the whole agreement. The disengagement from Gaza was accompanied by something called the Agreement on Movement and Access, which was supposed to establish how much commerce basically could take place between Gaza and Israel. That was signed in 2005, and by 2010, none of it had really been implemented, and it was, by that point, with Hamas in charge of Gaza, really pretty ineffectual. And I think in a more general sense, prime ministers like Olmert, who talked a dovish line, really didn't do much in very practical ways that could have eased the occupation and made it more possible to proceed to the grander two-state solution. So the issue of checkpoints within the West Bank, the issue of commerce across the Green Line from the West Bank into Israel, the location of the separation barrier, which caused great hardship on Palestinian communities. All of these things were done, in my view, in a very hawkish way, even when prime ministers like Olmert were talking in dovish terms. So the question is, can you define dovishness by what's being said rather than by looking at what's actually been done on the ground?
Yes, so once again, what I have very specific criteria that I use to define what's hawk and what's dove, because otherwise you get into the, well, every single response to a terrorism incident is seen as a hawkish response, or every checkpoint is seen as a hawkish policy. So I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you that some of what Olmert and others have done were less than constructive, but I would take exception to your point that that they didn't actually change. So not every belief change leads to a change in policy. It takes more than just somebody's belief change to actually get a major policy change. But I can tell you that in the case of Olmert, I don't think it was just some empty speeches he gave. I think he truly evolved, and we had the Al Jazeera leaks several years ago that confirmed, or seemed to confirm, that he was actually pretty close by his account, and I don't think Abbas has denied his account, or Abbas's people have denied his account, that they were pretty close to reaching an agreement, or about as close as any previous prime minister had been. So there had been ongoing talks despite the steps that you mentioned, and could have been more constructive but weren't. So I would give them maybe a little more credit for trying. And I don't disagree with you on Sharon and some of the other comments that you made. But not every belief change, I look at belief change, not every belief change is accompanied by a change of policy. There's so many other factors, including external factors, the other side, that matter as well. Yeah.
Zach Vidal, Senior. How much of the changes in whether it's rhetoric or policy do you think have to do with the context of how the Palestinian Authority or the PLO or Hamas talk about Israel, particularly, I guess, in the vein of Netanyahu now, with Abbas's language seemingly getting more and more hawkish? Do you think that has a significant effect on what Netanyahu maybe not only thinks he can do, but maybe can do and still maintain any form of political stability?
Good question. So I would argue that Abbas's rhetoric and rhetoric that you hear from Abbas's aides and ministers and other Palestinian leaders might impact how the Israeli public perceives Abbas. I don't think it has much impact on Netanyahu or other Israeli leaders for that matter, because the Israeli leaders who've accepted the idea, the notion of a two-state solution, are not doing it out of love for the Palestinians. They're doing it because they think that it is existentially important for Israel to remain a democratic and Jewish state.
Right.
They might be troubled by whatever Abbas might say or not say, but I don't think that that's really the crux of it. Now, you have a dispute in Israel as to whether or not Abbas is a partner. And here's where it kind of gets hairy, because most Israelis accept Netanyahu's narrative. And Netanyahu's narrative is that there is no peace partner on the other side. And I'm sure the Palestinians think the same thing about Netanyahu. But that's a narrative that's been widely accepted, and the center left has not done a very effective job in challenging that narrative. And I think that's a problem, but that's the commonly accepted narrative.
But do you think that language like that limits what, even if theoretically Netanyahu wanted to move in such a direction, which I don't believe he does, but even if he did want to, because such language like that changes, or maybe not changes, but reinforces that view within the Israeli public, do you think that really limits what his administration is capable of doing and still maintaining such?
To some extent, it's going to limit it because the Israeli public needs to be convinced, they need to be sold that they have a real legitimate, peace partner. And I mentioned earlier Sadat. Sadat really changed attitudes around dramatically when he came to visit Jerusalem, but he also paid a heavy price for that I don't think Arafat wanted to pay, and I don't think any other Palestinian leader has wanted to pay. And so to date, and so that definitely is a problem. But I don't think Netanyahu would move regardless of what Abbas says, because his constituents and his supporters are mostly on the right and ideologically opposed to the very idea of a Palestinian state. So I'm not sure you would see a real change here. I think also Netanyahu is very dismissive of Abbas. I mean, he seems to take Hamas a lot more seriously, and if there have been any negotiations that have been serious, it's been the negotiations with Hamas, for example, over the release of Gilad Shalit, who was held captive there for so many years. So I just don't see it having a major impact on Netanyahu per se. Back there.
I also have a small comment and then a question.
Sure.
The comment is that you do seem to have a definition of dovish based on a particular definition of what would promote peace, that is a two-state solution. Hypothetically, I'm not personally advocating this, but hypothetically there could be a serious notion of a one-state solution. So the notion of what dovish could mean could change. In any case, the question has to do with a number of questions that have come up from the audience about what else could account for this. And I know you don't want to be too academic, but this is a university, and you don't want to be too quantitative, but could you sort of say in general what amount of the variance is explained by the cognitive psychology model, and then generally for that percentage that's not, what you think are the major factors that account for the remainder?
Sure. I mean, and in my research, I find that, first let me agree with your comment that what counts as hot to duck today might very well change tomorrow. So I definitely accept that. In terms of your question, in my research, I do account for other factors. I look into other factors, and what I find is that the key causal variable is the cognitive structure of the individual. And that's going to determine, first and foremost, whether or not the leader is amenable, is likely to change his or her ideas, opinions, beliefs in light of changing circumstances or new information. So that's a critical causal factor, because if they're deemed to be more closed and simple, they're not likely to change their opinion, regardless of what happens on the ground. Then I look at triggering events that actually do make that difference when the events happen. So in the case of Peres, the triggering event was, there were a few triggering events. One was in the 70s with Sadat's visit to Israel. Another one was the collapse of the Jordanian option.
But I'm not asking about triggering events. I'm saying, you say this is the key causal factor.
Yes.
By key, do you mean it accounts for 55% of the willingness to change, or 75, or 90?
Well, I didn't do it. I mean, there's no way I can give you. That's just pure speculation. I mean, on my part, that would be pure speculation, because I didn't do a quantitative study. So what I can tell you is that in all the cases that I looked at, including the caselets that I looked at the end in my concluding chapter, in all these cases, the key causal variable, the one that's most important in explaining why one is more likely to evolve on an issue than another, is the cognitive structure. More so than all the other factors I look at, ideology and domestic politics, international systemic changes. All those are important in providing the context of why they change and when they change. But the most important factor in determining whether or not they're going to be affected by these changes is the cognitive structure. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't give a percentage.
Hi. Just one brief comment and then a question. So I think that what is very interesting to look at with those politicians that you say transition from hawkish to dovish positions is the effect of whether their parties had or had not primaries. That is their base support within their parties. If you look at Livni, if you look at Omer, if you look at Sharon, they were all the head of Kadima party, which had no primaries. They had not need to be accountable for the public in the same way that Netanyahu has to be accountable for members of Likud that are not parliament members, the population. This is an interesting thing to look at. And I don't know what was, by the way, the support back then, in terms of members of labor to Rabin or Peres, but the reason for Sharon to leave the Likud and establish Kadima in 2003 was because he could not do anything within Likud. So this is one. But my question is, can you explain a little bit about your methodology? Like, how did you do the research? I know it can take an entire 2 hours, but just a few minutes, if you can explain.
Sure. You're going to fall asleep here.
Yeah. What methodology were you using?
So I use discourse analysis and process tracing. And I can elaborate on that when I talk to you. But I did talk a little bit in my talk. I actually did address discourse analysis, or one of my answers, I addressed the discourse analysis and how I look at the language that the leaders use in terms of how open they are to different interpretations, how open they are to the possibility that they might be wrong, or that maybe one of their conclusions is a more tentative conclusion as opposed to a firm, definitive conclusion. So a lot of discourse analysis for each of these cases, and process tracing. It's a historical dissertation in large part, and I use copious amounts of archival documents that I found in 3 different archives in Israel that I spent a lot of time in, coupled with interviews, 57 interviews.
Well, thanks, Guy. I just wanted to, first of all, before I ask my question, just for clarification purposes, I think the language of necessary and sufficient is probably helpful in explaining what you mean by cause.
Yes.
You are saying that environmental change is necessary. So even if you have a leader whose cognitive structures are amenable to change, obviously if there's no environmental change, it's not going to happen. So the fact that you have the demographic realities, the fact that you have the external pressure, the fact that you have the shortcomings of the occupation, those are all necessary events, but in and of themselves, they're not going to tell you whether the leader is going to change in front of them. That change, that you need this additional element, right? So
exactly.
So you're not saying that the environmental change, no, you're saying it's necessary, it's absolutely necessary. It's not the leader just change dynamically. So that's important to add.
Sure.
The environmental change is a necessary component for explaining what happens, but it's not sufficient by itself because that additional element to do so. So, but I want to ask you a question, and also, one of the things that may not be clear, and in your book, you don't only look at, when you evaluate these personalities, you're not only doing it in the context of the peace process, you're looking at them outside of the peace process. So to make an evaluation about them in their lives and other arenas, so that you don't have this issue of circularity.
Exactly.
But still, I want to have a final question with regard to anticipating. So we now, you can, obviously the most difficult thing to do is to anticipate a personality type beforehand. So before, you decide to confront the decision. So the American diplomacy over the past few years, certainly during the Obama administration, the entire Obama administration is predicated on gambling on an assessment of Bibi Netanyahu. Everybody, the whole thing, I can tell you, as part of that team, the whole thing was, can he make peace? That's and it was, in fact, I call it a one-man strategy. In fact, they're obsessed with Bibi Netanyahu. How can we test him? How can we figure out whether he's capable of making the term? Because everybody assumed if he really wants to, he could make it happen. There was, at least that was an assumption in the U.S. So it's a huge question about, can he really do it? Sure. But you're not giving us an answer.
Okay, well, I didn't look at Netanyahu, only my conclusion, right? Do I talk about it? But I'm trying to give an answer by suggesting that with a cognitive analysis of Netanyahu, we can find a couple things that are interesting here, that are telling. I mentioned, for example, the aides that he surrounds himself with. I think that's very telling. When you're surrounding yourself, contrast him with Shimon Peres, who had Yossi Beilin, Uri Savir, and others, who were far more dovish than him on the ideological spectrum. But Gideon Levy, the firebrand, left-wing firebrand in Haaretz, was an aide to Shimon Peres that I also interviewed. All these people were far more dovish than Peres was, but he welcomed them on board because they were were ambitious, highly educated, and were not afraid to speak up their mind, and really pushed him hard. And one person described Balin as Peres's hard drive, or a second hard drive. So who really did have, over the years, an influence on his thinking on the Palestinian question. Now you contrast that with Netanyahu's hiring decisions, and you take a look at even Netanyahu's father said that my son doesn't know how to hire people. And that was, coming from his mentor. But he is surrounded, and has always been surrounded, by religious nationalists, for the most part, including our current ambassador, or the Israeli ambassador to Washington here, Ron Dermer, and others who were, very rigid ideologically in their views. And he's not getting, and he wants Likud loyalty, and he wants personal loyalty. So he's not getting kind of a broad range of perspectives. And so I think that's very telling in terms of his, less open receptivity to other points of view.
So are you telling the Obama administration, don't waste your time, it's not likely to change?
I mean, I didn't say that. I don't know if I would agree with that. I think that one thing we do see in terms of Netanyahu's background is that he has a tendency to succumb to pressure. And this was something we saw time and again during his first term, especially from 96 to 99. Dennis Ross writes about that in his book. So I think it's possible to get somebody to move even if they're not sold on it, even if they don't buy it. And this is something we saw, as I said, during Netanyahu's first term. He implemented the Hebron Agreement and the Wye River Agreement despite his fierce opposition to the Oslo Accord, primarily because he was pushed to do so by the Clinton administration. So if I were advising Obama today, I would not say give up. I would just say you're going to have a hard time changing his view, changing his mind. But that's very different than saying drop it and don't put any pressure on him.
I was impressed by the number of Israeli prime ministers who have become more dovish. But what I was also impressed with is the lack of consequences of that. I think we're in a worse position today than we were 25 years ago with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian problem. And so I wonder whether, in fact, we would expect in the future, if a prime minister swerved over to the dovish side, whether there would be actually any significant consequence of that. So have you any comment on this?
Can you just elaborate what you mean by consequences?
Well, I mean that the problem moves towards a solution.
Well, I think
we have an Israeli-Palestinian problem,
right,
which, as I said, I think has got worse over the last 25 years. So, and you defined your hawks and doves with respect to that problem.
Sure.
And your prime ministers have moved from one side to the dovish side, but in fact I don't see any particular improvement in the basic problem that you're discussing.
Right.
So
well,
I'm wondering, if we see a present prime minister, a future prime minister becoming more dovish, should we then expect to see a significant consequence with respect to the solution of the Palestinian?
So I think beyond my research and beyond my talk today about hawks versus doves, and I think what we're seeing is a failure of leadership in the region. There's a real failure across the board. The Palestinians are divided. I think Abbas is a worthy peace partner, but a weak one. And Israelis see that. And Netanyahu, I think, despite his bombastic rhetoric, I think he's a relatively weak leader who tends to be risk averse. And President Obama too has not really showed the kind of leadership on this issue in a consistently sustained manner that, say, Bill Clinton, I think showed. So I think that what we have is a failed leadership, and if somebody does in the next 5 years emerge as a real leader, I think we might have a serious movement that goes well beyond the whole hawk-dove divide that I talked about. Lauren?
Hi, Lauren Barr, I'm a researcher at the Icons Project here at
And a former student of mine.
And a former student at American University. So my question has to do with the cognitive structures and whether you find that these leaders are born somewhere along the spectrum of open or closed and simple or complex, or are there factors that can push them to become more open or more simple
Sure.
as time goes on, and possibly even the exposure to different perspectives? I know that can make an open person change their minds, but could it also make a closed person more open?
Sure. So great question, and proof that it's a great question is that was Dr. Talhami's question to me when I was working on my dissertation. Actually, the literature is a little bit split on that. There are some cognitive psychologists who say that it's more innate, that you're born with being thinking the way you think and with having the kind of structure that you have, and others argue that it's possible to change. And I kind of fall somewhere towards the wishy-washy middle, which is to say, it seems to be like some people are just more predisposed to be more open and complex than others, but that it is absolutely possible to see an evolution. And an example of that I came across is Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan, most people think of Ronald Reagan as this kind of rigidly right-wing, anti-communist Republican. But what's interesting is he comes to office as a lifelong anti-communist and calls the Soviet Union the evil empire. I mean, uses the kind of rhetoric that none of his predecessors had dared use. And then by the end of his first term, he's already singing a different tune and talking about a rapprochement with the Soviet leaders, wants to meet with them, wants to talk about ways to minimize the risk of nuclear warfare, because there were several back-to-back incidents during his first term that convinced him that even a greater danger to the United States than communism is the possibility of nuclear warfare. And there was Able Archer, there was the made-for-TV movie The Day After that he saw and what deeply affected. NATO military exercises, war briefings that he got, all within a period. These back-to-back events all happened within a period of a year and a half. And he really became, he kind of learned in that process that, yes, communism is bad and never wavered in that, but he wavered in his priorities and changed his priorities in terms of what was important and what not. And so he became a different kind of leader towards the Soviets towards the end of his first term and second term than he was during the first couple of years because of these incidents. So I think he's somebody who, as a couple of scholars have shown, did, and who looked at it from a political psychology perspective, found him to be someone who became more cognitively complex and open than he was initially. But the openness part was actually there more or less all along. In fact, the running joke among his aides was, he listened to any aide who would talk to him, but he would tend to adopt the position of the last aide that he talked to. So everybody was always scrambling to be the last person to talk to Ronald Reagan before he made a decision.
Stephen Stern. That leads me to ask the Reagan example in terms of rigidity versus openness as in cognitive psychology, the rigidity of Hawk versus Dove schemes. Is there some way that a next level of analysis or things that you were looking at in terms of ideology, in terms of events on the ground, if there's kind of a dynamic scoring in which you can push this this psychological evaluation of leadership into both facts on the ground, new ideas, coming a kind of a rolling analysis that might be more rigorous in terms of what we see ahead of us?
Yeah, I mean, the idea here is to apply my findings to other cases, which is why now I'm engaged in studying Netanyahu and trying to kind of watch who's next on the Israeli political scene, because I study primarily Israeli leaders, but I feel like this framework could also apply to any leader, including our leaders here. I mean, I did some preliminary work on U.S. presidents, and of course with Bush, you really find a lot of the, you're with us or you're against us type of approach that really speaks to that cognitive simplicity, as opposed to Obama, who is, went on a listening tour listens well. It doesn't translate into being a good president or a bad president or an effective leader or ineffective leader, but it does tell you how likely one is to evolve in an issue versus remain committed to his or her policies.
But in terms of hawk versus dove and two-state paradigm,
Okay.
there was a question here
Yeah.
in terms of, we're saying, if we look at the last 25 years as the essence was two-state negotiations,
Right.
and now there is a new fact on the ground that maybe we are looking for post-Oslo. There's facts on the ground, and how two-state, one-state come into it.
So, I mean, the predominant paradigm in Israel today is the two-state solution, okay, versus the status quo. The so-called one-state solution is held by a small minority of activists primarily, but is not something that has been embraced by politicians, security experts. It's actually been embraced by some on the right, on the far right, like Caroline Glick of the Jerusalem Post, who was rumored to be joining Likud and ended up not joining Likud on its current slate, on its current list. But that hasn't yet become part of the political lexicon in Israel or discussion. So it'd be interesting in the years ahead if that changes. But as of now, we're still using the paradigm of the two-state solution that many argue is under threat and may not be around for that much longer. Yeah.
Yes, Larry. I think maybe you're simplifying too much what a dove is, because a dove 10 years ago was not a dove today. It's not. And among my Israeli friends who were basically involved with peace now, objectives of that sort, there's an enormous fear because of the radical disruption and chaos in the Arab world that in the short term you couldn't actually get a comprehensive two-state solution, given the risks involved with radical groups, and so you have to take some kind of step-by-step approach and intermediate agreements. And that's a very different kind of point of view.
Sure. I mean, but absolutely, and I didn't mean to suggest that all hawks or all doves share the same opinion. And there's long been a debate in Israel as to whether or not a two-state solution is, among adherents of the two-state solution, is best achieved gradually, incrementally, in a step-by-step process, or kind of lay it all on the table and do it all at once. The danger of having a step-by-step process at this point is that time is running out. I mean, you have the Palestinian population that's very desperate, that is already doubtful and skeptical of Israel's true intentions. And I just don't know if Israel has the luxury of dragging it out. And I don't know if it's in Israel's interest either to want to necessarily drag it out. I mean, the idea of Oslo, which obviously failed, was to have a final status agreement or negotiate a final status agreement in 5 years. But really more to the point is not whether or not it's possible today to have a two-state solution, but is it possible? But why is the government not negotiating in a serious manner with the Palestinian Authority? Why aren't they trying? Why don't we see an effort? That was the raison d'etre of Tzipi Livni and Yair Lapid when they joined the Netanyahu government before he let them go. And after Kerry broker talks collapsed last April, the idea was that there would be a new opportunity at some point where talks could be renewed. And many observers thought that maybe after the Gaza war last August, that would be a good opportunity for Netanyahu to at least spruce up the support of Abbas, who lost a lot of clout in the West Bank, who, according to Khalil Shikaki's polls today, would lose in a head-to-head race with Haniya of Hamas, that Netanyahu could have helped Abbas in at least resuming negotiations. So the question is not whether or not it's completely feasible to have a solution today, but why isn't there a process? Why isn't there a full-fledged aggressive effort in which to do so?
Well, thanks so much.